The year is 1879, and somewhere between miles of dust-coated sagebrush and the never-ending creak of a slow-turning windmill, we arrive at a small wooden building with a swinging pair of doors that never seem to close all the way, thanks to a hinge that retired early. This is a Western saloon. To the casual passerby, it's just a drinking hole. To the seasoned traveler, it's something closer to a tent revival, minus the sermons, plus more chairs broken over heads. But to men, especially lonely, weary, and disproportionately mustachioed ones, the saloon was much more than a place to sip whiskey. It was, quite frankly, the 19th century equivalent of a combination therapy session, gossip forum, musical concert, job fair, fashion show, and occasionally a makeshift dentist's office. Yes, Western ingenuity knew no bounds nor boundaries. Now, while whiskey was certainly poured, and poured again most enthusiastically, it wasn't always the reason men were shambling toward the saloon's flickering lantern light like moths with questionable facial hair. In truth, what men were actually paying for, more often than not, had far less to do with alcohol and far more to do with something a little harder to manufacture: ambiance, a mood, a shared illusion that something exciting might happen, so long as you just ordered one more sarsaparilla and stayed upright. Let's start with the music. They called them saloon girls, but their job wasn't what Hollywood might suggest. These women were often hired not for scandal, but for stamina, the ability to sing, dance, and chat with male patrons for hours, making each man feel like the most interesting person west of the Pecos, even if he'd been using a potato sack as pants for 2 weeks. Saloon pianos were often terribly out of tune. The keys stuck like a mule's knees in winter, and no one was ever quite sure whether the left pedal worked or simply pretended to as a polite courtesy. But the player, usually some nimble-fingered fellow who looked like he hadn't slept indoors since Lincoln was elected, pounded out jigs, reels, waltzes, and the occasional chaotic improvisation that might have been a song and might have just been him losing a fight with the keyboard. Then there were the games. Ah, yes, games of chance. Except there wasn't much chance if you didn't know what you were doing. Faro, poker, 21, the elegant French cousin of blackjack. And for the more desperate, how long before the sheriff notices we're cheating? All were played beneath hazy lantern glow and clouds of cigar smoke, a sweet almondy blend of optimism and bad decisions. But here's the thing. Professional gambling men, often the best-dressed people in the room, weren't running a charity. They wore slick waistcoats and the kind of mustaches that could legally sign documents. They were smooth, charming, and about as trustworthy as a rattlesnake in Sunday school. Still, people paid to play, because losing money in style is still, to this day, a very specific kind of thrill. Now, if you think the saloon was all chips and grins, think again. Hygiene wasn't just optional, it was theoretical. Towels were recycled until they qualified as antique washcloths, and a bottle of cologne was likely doing double or triple duty as shaving tonic, floor cleaner, and air freshener. Customers mostly ignored the smell, the floors sticky with various types of failure, and the occasional chicken wandering through, possibly named Gary. And then there was the real prize. Company. Human contact. Loose, chaotic, friendly or otherwise. Entire towns sprang up overnight during gold rushes, and with them came saloons, ready to unburden men from their earnings almost as quickly as they'd found them. These were places where news traveled faster than the postal service ever could. Women's names were whispered like poetry. Fortunes were both rumored and evaporated before dessert, in that golden twilight of the 1800s, long before radio, long before Netflix, even long before arguing on the internet seemed like a good use of time. There was the saloon, a place where people came not just to drink, but to feel a little more alive, even if that meant watching Simon No Teeth Jenkins try to flirt with a waitress while simultaneously forgetting how hats work. And perhaps, just perhaps, at the end of the night, they'd tell a story worth retelling, or at least one that sounded better after whiskey. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, hush. Let's follow that piano tune a little further, down corridors of saloon smoke and stories not yet fully told. By the time a fella pushed open the swinging batwing doors of a Western saloon, the dust of the day had already settled into every inch of his being, his boots crusted with trail grit, his eyebrows collecting more particles than a windowsill during a drought. These were men who'd been pushing cattle or shuffling pickaxes, and their reward at the end of it all? Not just whiskey. Oh no. That was merely the shimmering surface of the saloon experience, because what these weary wanderers were really paying for, my dear dozer of dreams, wasn't just in the glass. It was in the illusion it poured. Let's take a soft step back, shuffle our spurred boots quietly onto the worn floorboards of a saloon in, say, 1874 Wyoming. The piano keys are sticking on the high notes. The smell is equal parts fresh sawdust and tobacco coverage, and the hat on your head is more for manners than sun. Inside, you'll find a curious ecosystem of denial and decor, and everyone's playing along. See, saloons weren't simply drink dispensaries. They were curated theaters of masculine fantasy. Out front, they promised booze and perhaps brawls, sure, but also the promise of being someone for a night. A gunslinger, a card shark, a dancer's confidant, or simply a man whose name somebody remembered. And that's where the real artistry came in. Behind the bar, amidst a glittering wall of dusty bottles and hand-polished spittoons, stood the bartender, more therapist than mixologist. Sure, the whiskey might be half turpentine and a whisper of regret, but the bartender, he'd serve it with a knowing nod, a smile that said, "I see you, stranger, and you're doing just fine." These men were part showmen, part social engineers, and every so often, semi-pro referees. But let's drift a little deeper. Many saloons employed what were known as painted ladies, though their job descriptions were far more complicated than polite society liked to admit. Some were indeed sex workers, it's true, but many were entertainers hired to elevate the mood. They played piano, sang sentimental ballads, and most vitally, encouraged customers to buy drinks. These drinks, mind you, were priced just generously enough to justify the ladies' company. That mysterious amber liquid. It might be watered-down whiskey, or even rock gut, a concoction of raw alcohol, burnt sugar, and the faintest rumor of flavoring. But wrapped in lace smiles and soft banter, it tasted like hope, or at least distraction, which was often close enough. And let us not overlook the majesty of the saloon mirror. You know the one, tall, ornate, standing behind the bar like a silent guardian of all secrets spilled into shot glasses. It wasn't just decor, it was strategy. That gilded mirror allowed lonely men to gaze upon themselves mid-drink and momentarily believe they were sharper, younger, or more dashing than reality dictated. A fleeting editorial to the daily newsletter of their lives. Now, some men came to gamble, which added another layer to the illusion. Card tables weren't just games of chance. No, they were stages upon which people played versions of themselves. The gambler, the rube, the quiet assassin with a tell hidden behind a mustache, waxed within an inch of its life. Winning or losing mattered certainly, but not nearly as much as being seen. Because in a world that moved fast, forgot quickly, and buried mistakes faster than a prairie dog in a rainstorm, being remembered, just for a moment, was worth a quarter bottle of bottom-shelf bourbon. And sometimes, what men were paying for wasn't even human company at all. Pianists cobbled together half-tunes on out-of-tune pianos, determined to wring melody from chaos. These songs weren't just background noise. They were distractions from the loneliness that hung in the rafters like cobwebs. A ragtime tune was a balm, a foot-tapping illusion that everything, for one tipsy night, might be okay. So no, Men didn't walk into saloons simply for a drink. They came seeking momentary resurrection, paid for in drinks, games, gentle lies, and laughter half a beat too loud. And if you think the bartender knew how to pour illusions into glasses, just wait until you hear about the mysterious economics behind free lunches and pickled eggs. In the humid, whiskey-scented air of the average Western saloon, the cash didn't just clink for drinks and cards, it chimed for something far more precious in the dust-cloaked day-to-day of frontier life: human attention. You see, beneath the glint of swinging glassware and the chorus of piano keys being mildly abused in the corner, saloons were Western civilization's answer to therapy. Only, instead of a licensed psychologist, you got a sharp-tongued bartender named Gus. And instead of deep introspection, you were more likely to share your feelings through the medium of heavy drinking and spontaneous, impromptu poetry. It turns out that in the West, loneliness had an echo. And it echoed loudest in these crowded, smoky rooms where men gathered for not just libations, but for the balm of being seen. A man could ride for days and not see another human face, just shrubs and buzzards and the occasional coyote that judged you silently from a distance. So when he stepped through those iconic batwing doors, what he craved more than bourbon was banter, laughter. Maybe a girl to bat her lashes at him in exchange for a coin or two, and the courtesy of pretending his mustache didn't smell like saddle leather. And this brings us to one of the saloon's most traded commodities: conversation. Yes, actual talking. Not always polite, rarely profound, but deeply human. It was the kind of conversation where no one expected you to solve any problems or recall the names of classical composers. That could be bought with a few coins and a round of drinks. And if you were really flush, maybe you could buy someone's ear for the evening, a friendly saloon girl or a fellow rancher whose ribs you accidentally elbowed in a particularly enthusiastic game of dominoes. Saloon. Girls, contrary to popular legend and spaghetti Western simplification, were not all innuendo and velvet. Many made most of their money simply by sitting with men, drinking watered-down whiskey, a savvy cost-cutting practice, and listening as the cowboys wax poetic about lost fortunes, unfaithful horses, or the unbearable moral torment of stealing a neighbor's goat. These women were equal parts companionship and performance, equal parts listener and local celebrity. They were often expected to dance, sing, laugh at bad jokes, and maintain a mechanical twinkle in the eye, all while carefully guiding conversations away from topics like gunshot wounds, inflation, and the terrible fate of good boots in bad mud. There were also the barkeeps themselves, who were the true underpaid therapists of the Old West. A proper barkeep could pour a drink, counsel a lovesick miner, mediate a duel, and gently escort a sleep-sobbing cattleman out the door, using nothing but calm words and a mop. Handle. These barmen, often misunderstood as just liquor dispensers, knew every face in town, and whether that face should or should not be trusted with credit. And let's not forget the entertainers, the odd harmonica virtuoso, an out-of-tune piano man, or the mysterious fiddle player who may or may not have once been banished from Missouri for reasons no one dared explore. Music in the saloon wasn't exactly Carnegie Hall, but it was often the closest thing to culture many of the patrons had between birth and burial. Most songs were a blend of waltz and whiskey sorrow, either telling tales of lonesome cowhands or goats tragically lost in flash floods. Not unlike today's pop music when you think about it, it's important to remember that Western saloons were, at their core, social utilities dressed up in mahogany and mischief. A man could come in starving for conversation, aching for acknowledgement, and if he was lucky, leave with a bruised ego, an empty wallet, and the kind of blurry satisfaction that comes from being, just for a moment, part of something. So no, not every dollar spent in those raucous rooms was buying booze. Many were paying for eye contact, tired smiles, and the sweet illusion that someone, somewhere, gave a hoot if your mule got struck by lightning. And in a world where silence rode shotgun and shadows grew long early, that illusion was more precious than gold dust. Now, as the evening wears on and the lamps glow dim, the wind outside still whispering through the cracks in the walls, let us slip down another corridor of this old saloon life, where the drinks weren't always what they seemed, and water might just have been the most suspicious thing behind the bar. The pianola was still creaking out a tune that sounded vaguely like Camptown races being played underwater. Off in a dusty corner of the saloon, a miner in a moth-eaten bowler hat was having a staring contest with a pickle jar. Around him swirled the soft smokiness of cigarillos, spilled whiskey, and dreams only partially remembered. But amid the tinkling glasses and flirtatious laughter of the so-called entertainers, there was something else men were paying for in these establishments. Something less glamorous, less scandalous, and far more financially sound. They were paying to sit, yes, rest their weary posterior ends, in an age when the average cowboy's day included roughly 11 hours of riding mules, lifting crates, digging for imaginary gold, and getting into brawls with weathered men named Jim Bob. A wooden chair with a straight back and questionable stability was a luxury not to be taken for granted, and most certainly not handed out without charge. You see, the dusty trails of the American West weren't exactly furnished with lounges and napping pods. A man might spend months in the open, cooking beans over a fire, dodging snakes, sleeping in itchy long underwear, and using his saddle as a pillow, a decision that every spinal cord quickly came to regret. So when he finally stumbled into town, red-eyed and sun-flaked, the saloon offered not just whiskey to polish away the memory of coyotes and disappointing breakfast stew. It offered a chair, a place to sit, to lean, to sigh like a punctuation mark only the soul knows how to write. And many of these chairs, and bear with me here, could be found only with the purchase of a drink. That's right, a kind of early American cover charge, the old butts on seats business model. If you're going to spend 4 hours playing poker, gossiping about the price of beaver pelts, and pretending not to cry into your beer while remembering your horse ran away with the dentist's sister, then, sir, you're politely invited to order something. Don't want a whiskey? Fine. Some saloons offered sarsaparilla, lemonade, or what's best described as uncertain coffee. But try to warm up on a cold Kansas night just sitting by. The stove without a drink in your hand, and the barkeep would perform a slow, theatrical cough that translated to get out or get paying. Now, let's take things up a notch. Some saloons were clever, devious even. They made comfort into currency. The worst bar stools were purposefully uncomfortable, too narrow for the hips, too tall for the legs. One popular model, affectionately dubbed the ankle wrecker, encouraged immediate inebriation if only to become numb to the sitting experience. But for an extra coin, upgraded seating, cushions, armrests. One New Mexico saloon, now long gone and so is the cushion, even had a gentleman's rocker stationed by the fire. Legend says you could sit in it after ordering the premium whiskey, and one fellow was so relaxed he forgot he was married and simply never went home again. Of course, sitting wasn't just about comfort. It was strategic, observational, vital even. From a good seat, preferably one not near the back door, which had a real habit of swinging open whenever anyone needed a dramatic exit, you could observe everything. The poker tables, the card shops, the gentleman farmers whose hats never quite matched their boots and who were probably up to no good. A good seat gave you a line of sight to the mirror behind the bar, a small square of polished silver that let you see who was coming, who was going, and, most importantly, who just touched your hat without asking. In a world where life could change dramatically between your first drink and your third, having a solid sitting position wasn't just pleasant, it was survival. And now, as the lantern light flickers low, and the piano player takes an unceremonious nap across his own keys, you begin to see how the saloon was many things to many people. A place of music, mismatched card games, peculiar chairs, and surprisingly expensive lemonade. But beyond the furniture, beyond the warm cushions that took the edge off a crooked spine and a colder life, saloons were places where stories were traded more often than coins, and those stories, too, were part of the price. Paid and received. Some of them were even true. Some. Now, with your feet propped on the ghost of an old cowboy's footstool and your head filled with the fog of frontier absurdity, stretch gently, breathe deeper, and let your thoughts meander toward the unsung drink menus of the American West, quietly waiting in the dusty breeze. When the batwing doors creaked open, yes, the same wooden slabs that flopped back and forth as dramatically as a stage curtain, the hopeful cowpoke stepped inside not just for whiskey, but often for something far more magical, and dare we say, quieter. You see, in the fevered imagination of dime novels, the saloon was a place of brawls, bawdy chuckles, and whiskey poured like water. But just behind that noisy bar, past the piano player, who knew 1.5 songs very well, lay a secret economy of reading. Yes, reading. Literacy had cracked open the frontier like a tin of beans, and weary laborers often shelled out silver coins, not only for spirits, but for serial fiction, newspapers, or, brace yourself, sheet music. Many saloons were proud to carry small libraries, or what some referred to with a straight face as gentlemanly amusements. These weren't your local Carnegie libraries, not yet anyway, but they offered a rickety bookshelf in the corner where even the stickiest fingers of the Nevada territories could peruse the printed word. And this was no mere accident. In the mid to late 1800s, saloon owners began to notice something. If you gave a customer a full bottle of bourbon, they'd knock it back and leave. But if you handed them a newspaper or pulp cereal and charged a nickel a page, or just let them read it slowly while buying drinks, they might stay for hours. A drunk man pays once, a half-literate man pays all night. To meet demand, traveling salesmen came loaded down not only with liquor and bitters, but with trunks clanking with pamphlets, novelettes, and even French fashion papers. Some of these little magazines had thrilling tales of London fog, Egyptian mummies, or Illinois murderesses. Others had long, meandering stories with carefully veiled romance that didn't technically scandalize anyone, so long as they ended with someone marrying the sheriff. Readers squinted through tobacco smoke and candlelight, often aloud, to no one in particular. Reading aloud was cool back then. Instagram for your ears. In places like Deadwood or Abilene, these reading rooms expanded into curiosity cabinets of the printed word. Miners, who'd spent the last 6 weeks excavating silver and ignoring personal hygiene, suddenly found themselves chin in hand, sighing dramatically over Chapter 11 of a Western novella called something like Dusty Sheridan and the Devil's Bride. Literacy rates, albeit uneven, were on the rise. Edibi post-Civil War, and folks learned to recognize the syntax of pulp drama before they learned to spell Cincinnati. Women, too, especially the savvy saloon girls in shimmering skirts and knowing smirks, might hold a deck of playing cards in one hand and a penny dreadful in the other, pretending not to be interested in whatever oily gambler was bending her ear. But rest assured, she was deeply immersed, if not in the plot, then in the subtle habit of watching who could and could not read well enough to make money. Businessmen, traveling physicians, poetry-quoting barkeeps, they all understood the marketing power of the printed word. Some barkeeps went so far as to publish their own house newsletters, scrawled, mimeographed, and sold for a dime, complete with bar gossip, satirical horoscopes, and limericks of highly questionable taste, and it would be a grave mistake to leave out the maps. Every good saloon kept a few thumbtacked maps of nearby goldfields, rails, expansion plots, or land bristling with hypothetical cattle. Drunken dreams required visuals after all. One should never underestimate the power of a hand-drawn railroad on a whiskey-soaked wall to inspire a co-op investment in speculative mineral rights. So, while movies like to show the dusty barroom as a place where chairs fly and mustached strangers steal glances from across poker tables, don't forget the man in the corner with a shot of cheap brandy and a book titled The Copper Bride's Secret Vow. He is no less heroic. He simply fights his demons with adjectives. Even more quietly, lurking near the back of the saloon, was the other half of the story. It was neither shootouts nor sherry that kept many patrons glued to their seats, but a type of entertainment that spoke directly to the lonely hearts and idle hands of the western frontier. And it didn't involve guns or gossip, but it did involve nimble fingers and a slightly out-of-tune piano. But we'll wander over to that particular corner in due time. After your eyes get just a bit heavier, let the words drift like smoke, and we'll pick up where the melody begins. If you ever find yourself wide awake at 2:17 a.m., sipping imaginary sarsaparilla and staring into the wooden grain of your ceiling, wondering what lurked behind those swinging saloon doors beyond whiskey and uh-oh decisions, well, cozy up. Because no one sauntered into a Wild West saloon entirely for the rye whiskey or the chance to lose gold dust playing faro. Not even the mustachioed cowpokes who wore their hats indoors like it was part of their soul. No, behind the tobacco haze, the clinking of tin cups, and the sound of boots scraping against sand-dusted floorboards, there was something subtler, something humbler, something arguably more peculiar than a bar brawl over a card game no one actually understood. It was companionship, in all its strange, dusty, western glory. Let's dim the gaslights and step into the shoes of a lonesome cowhand, trail-weary and unpredictably sentimental after 8 weeks of staring at cows, cactus, and silence. What he sought in that saloon wasn't just warmth in a shot glass. He was seeking more human warmth. A chance conversation. A sense of someone remembering your name without immediately charging you for hay storage. Saloon girls. Now here is where many an old Western myth took its boots off and exaggerated things. Hollywood would have you believe they were all sultry con artists with legs for days and an eye for trouble. But the reality? It's a touch more embroidered. A saloon girl in the Old West was, yes, often attractive in the theatrical sense. But her main job was part waitress, part performer, part psychologist, and at least 17% sleep-deprived magician. She was paid to flirt, dance, laugh at questionable jokes, and occasionally kick an unruly miner in the shins, all while helping to sell more drinks, which she earned commission from. You see, in the saloon economy, the whiskey kept the shelves looking busy, but it was the women who kept the men spending. It wasn't about scandal so much as it was about fostering the idea that out in a lawless and unpredictable world, maybe someone found you interesting, or at the very least, tolerably not awful. Keep in mind, this was the era when letters were slow, eye contact meant everything, and your deodorant options were, how shall we say, severely limited. The average bachelor hadn't spoken to a woman in weeks unless she was feeding him soup in a tavern with no signage and a mysterious smell. So the mere idea of dancing a two-step with someone who smelled faintly of rosewater and didn't carry a lasso was, for many, worth every glimmering silver coin. And it wasn't just about the saloon girls. Many patrons came in hoping for what I'll call, lovingly, temporary status. For an hour or two, you were no longer a saddle-sore wanderer with zero ambition and a raccoon problem. No, inside those creaky saloon walls, you could be a high-rolling card sharp or a would-be cattle baron. The only IRS agent you'd need to fear was a jealous blackjack dealer. Gentle talk, warm light, music that sounded about 17% in tune. These were the Western comforts that money could buy. And there was something almost sacred in it. An odd little ecosystem where money, mirages, and make-believe danced cheek to cheek. Let us also pause for a moment to appreciate the pianist. There, stationed at upright pianos that had seen better decades, were the unacknowledged rock stars of the Old West. Their job was to play something lively enough to keep fights from breaking out, but not too lively. lest someone try to jump the bar. They earned their tips with music, yes, but also with the ability to survive fire, spilt beer, and the occasional flying boot without missing a single note. So what were men really paying for? Yes, they bought drinks. Yes, they bought arounds. But what they truly purchased, perhaps a better word is rented, was permission. Permission to pretend, for one dusty evening, that the world wasn't trying to kill them. To tip their hats to familiarity, bask in illusion, and sit in the gentle warmth of shared make-believe. And isn't that worth every cent of that 50-cent whiskey? Now that we've swayed a bit through the slow dance of cowboy courtship and piano lullabies, let's step out of the saloon's soft lamplight and wander toward another curious corner of Western spirit, where the drinks are fake, the fighting is staged, and the amusement comes with a ticket stub. As twilight stretched across the dusty horizon, casting sleepy lavender over creaking boardwalks and wobbling whiskey signs, the saloon house glowed like a sleepy lantern in the dusk, dim, warm, and stumbling slightly to the left. Inside, men weren't just paying for drinks, nor just for the company of a twangy fiddle or a flirtatious wink from a corseted card dealer. No, tucked behind the bravado and bar brawls was a commodity even more intoxicating than rye whiskey: information. Behind the swinging bat-wing doors and beyond the clatter of boots on uneven floorboards, saloons doubled as the clunky, creaky internet cafes of the Old West. If you wanted to know who stole Jed Wilkins's prize hog, or whether Doc Holliday really cheated at poker using a mirror in his boot, you didn't go to the sheriff. You went to the saloon. Specifically, you paid the barkeep. Now, mind you, barkeeps were not just masters of the poor, but also quiet symphony conductors of gossip. They had the ears of priests and the memory of elephants, slightly drunk elephants, but elephants nonetheless. Their bar counters held up more than elbows. They held secrets, grudges, and occasionally a sleepy gold prospector who cursed in German. To eavesdrop at a saloon was to enroll yourself full-time in small-town intelligence 101. What you were really paying for between your whiskey and your cider bottle with a cartoon worm smiling from the glass was raw, unfiltered, locally sourced drama. And information that came at a premium. What happened to Clem after the mining accident? Who's buying up cavalry horses over at the edge of town? Is that new gambler in town really French, or just someone who found a mustache in a rail yard? Each drop of gossip was stitched through whispers, sealed with a nod, and paid for with a drink or two. Sometimes more, depending on the quality of the scandal. A full exposé involving a preacher's runaway daughter and a stolen cow. That was a 3-drink tale with a tip. Minimum. It wasn't all idle chatter either. For many frontier towns, the local saloon replaced the need for something as formal and emotionally papery as a newspaper. Newsprint was hard to come by, and honest journalism even rarer. But a bar stool and a set of curious ears, that was free press, with better facial hair. And sometimes the information business got competitive. There are recorded moments, yes, actual historical moments, when saloons competed over which establishment had the best news or most intriguing rumors. At least one New Mexico saloon posted a chalkboard summary of happenings and maybes, which included updates from incoming stage lines, reports from Fort Stanton, and a rating system for new itinerant jug bands. The saloon thus evolved into the Frontier's newsroom, its social club, and, depending on the day, impromptu courtroom. If two gamblers argued over the rules of Pharaoh, the barkeep would murmur some decisive-sounding nonsense and bang a spoon on the bar for effect. Unfounded, certainly. Effective, almost always. After all, you don't question someone who controls your alcohol distribution. And then there were saloon diaries. Yes, diaries. Not the personal kind, weepy with ink smears and pressed flower petals, but ledgers kept behind the counter. Many barkeeps kept notes of interactions, Debts and scandals scribbled in haphazard shorthand. September 3rd, Lyle fell asleep on slot table again. Mule's still missing. Bessie thinks Jonas's beard is fake. Future historians have pored over these alcoholic annals like sacred texts, decoding the rich inner lives of towns founded mostly because someone with a shovel kept digging downhill. So when a weary cowboy tossed a coin on the counter, he wasn't just buying a drink. He was buying a ticket, an entrance to the communal theatre of tall tales and town truth, where everyone knew each other and no one quite knew the whole story. As piano notes stretched like yawns through the smoky twilight, the secrets brewed beneath silver-backed mirrors and cloudy glassware. The barkeep winked. Someone muttered about gold in the canyon, and a wide-eyed traveler leaned in. And just like that, the real currency of the West passed from mouth to ear. Gently now, let's wander toward the edge of the barroom, where the cards are being reshuffled. And something curious is happening near the piano. As the sun dipped behind the chipped rooftops of frontier towns and the dusty glow of oil lanterns flickered to life inside the saloon windows, a different kind of transaction began to take root. This one a little less rowdy than a poker game and far less predictable than a duel at high noon. You see, while whiskey and waltzes often got top billing in Western saloons, what many men were actually paying for after dark was the privilege of companionship that didn't always revolve around flirtation or card games. No, sometimes they were paying simply to be listened to. Believe it or not, in the golden glow of parlor lamps and the scent of pipe smoke and lemon oil polish, many saloon-goers sought out what we might now call emotional customer service. That's right. These dusty-shirted cowboys and trail-weary miners, after a day of digging, branding or dodging horseflies the size of ravioli, were in dire need of a little human kindness. And that's where the real business artistry of some saloon houses came into play. Enter the parlor girl. Now, don't confuse her with the showgirl, nor the much-discussed soiled dove who operated upstairs under quieter contracts. Parlor girls were charm artisans, hired not for scandal, but for sophistication, by loosely 1880s standards at least. They were conversationalists, entertainers, and occasional peacekeepers. Their job: to make a man feel, for the length of a drink or a soft piano tune, like he wasn't entirely alone out west. Wearing silk dresses that rustled like moth wings and gloved hands that never held a spittoon, a good parlor girl had a laugh that could deflate egos and inflate wallets. She knew how to ask just the right sort of question. Did you always want to be a blacksmith? Tell me about your horse. What color is he? Is Arizona as dry as they say? It wasn't therapy, per se, but for the going rate of a bourbon and some small change dropped into the coin slot of informal affection, you could at least pretend someone cared why you left Illinois. And the saloon house benefited plenty. A fellow who's halfway ensconced in a story about his childhood raccoon is a fellow who's not likely to cause a bar fight. Management approved. After all, less broken furniture meant less time nailing the stools back together with whatever rusty implements they had lying around. Some parlor girls, in fact, were so talented at their conversational craft that they developed loyal followings. Certain regulars would only frequent a given saloon to speak with Miss Lillian, or Miss Margie, or perhaps the enigmatic Miss Grace, who was known for her sarsaparilla sweet voice and her astonishing knowledge of Civil War trivia, possibly invented on the spot. Now, it wasn't all cozy chats and bedtime tales. Many parlor girls had to fend off unwanted advances, master the delicate art of unspoken boundaries, and navigate a fine line between flattery and firm no's. It took a certain finesse to decline a gentleman's advances without bruising the tender masculinity that had just crossed 2 deserts and a rattlesnake to get there. Still, their importance to the saloon ecosystem can't be overstated. They were air conditioners of the emotional variety, cooling down overheated egos before they exploded into punch-ups or property damage. That's no small feat when you're working with cowboys raised on pickled optimism and campfire paranoia. And so, nestled between whiskey barrels and velvet drapes, within earshot of clinking glasses and out-of-tune pianos, These women ran a quiet empire of dialogue, selling nothing more than attention, empathy, and perhaps the illusion that someone remembered your real name. It's this strange, soft power that kept many saloon houses thriving, offering weary men not just liquor and games, but something closer to home, or rather, the idea of one. And just as a dimming lamp leaves soft shadows over aging wallpaper, our world of Western saloon life continues to disclose its odd, dreamy details, one rusty hinge at a time. Next, we draw back a heavy red curtain and peek into the curious economics of bottle tricks, bar flair, and how whiskey became more profitable as performance art than it ever was in the glass. Out west, in the dust-draped corners of saloon society, where the piano played slightly flat and the whiskey poured slightly sideways, an institution quietly propped up the entire operation, not with bullets, not with cards, and not even with a lively jig. No, the real linchpin of many a saloon's success was none other than the food. Yes, it might scandalize your image of rough-and-tumble cowboys bathing in bourbon and bravado, but behind the creaky saloon doors was often a modest kitchen where someone, usually a woman, occasionally a very tired man, labored over a pot of beans that had been simmering so long they'd formed their own political party. You see, the saloon, though it wore the costume of dangerous indulgence, was, at heart, a community hub, a place of warmth, gossip, and, somewhat miraculously, pot roast. And when dusk fell across frontier towns like Deadwood or Dodge, hungry men ambled through the littered doorways, not just in search of rye or roulette, but looking, perhaps with the same fervor, for supper. Of course, not all meals were created equal. In truth, the culinary standards of the average Western saloon hovered somewhere between desperate and digestive gamble. The establishment might advertise free lunch in bold letters, visible clear to the next territory, but one had to read the unwritten footnote, alcohol purchase required. Side effects may include existential despair. This so-called free lunch spread was a curious invention, a marketing ploy cleverly designed to tempt patrons into more drinking than dining. Saloons would lay out a table, or if funds were tight, a very convincing-looking board, stocked with whatever could be easily salted, pickled, or disguised. Sardines, hard-boiled eggs with the aroma of legacy, cold meats of questionable lineage, celery sticks for decoration, which no one in 1884 had any idea how to eat. But oh, that table told stories. It bore witness to drifters and sheriffs, salesmen and swindlers, each scooping up a ladleful of mystery stew and nodding politely, because what else could one do in the face of stew that glared back? Then there was the more ambitious fare. In the more established saloons, especially those in boomtowns flush with silver and swagger, food became a means of display. Oysters, yes, oysters, were shipped by rail or horse cart, packed in sawdust and hope, kept on ice that may or may not have been ice during arrival. One Denver saloon even prided itself on having champagne and caviar on the menu. The cowboys, of course, didn't know which to open first. And the cooks, often unsung, often unpaid in actual money, they played an invisible role in the great saloon theater. Some were frontier women with years of biscuit wisdom passed down in quiet kitchens. Others were formerly enslaved men, Chinese immigrants, or Mexican caretakers who brought with them flavors that twirled and dipped through pots, surprise by surprise. The late-night crowd would stumble in, full of adrenaline and missed poker hands, noses twitching toward the smoky scent of cornbread. The hearth, if a saloon had one, glowed steady beneath a cast-iron pot the size of a small planet. Chuck wagon stews, chili con carne, fried trout if the creek hadn't frozen over yet, all earthy offerings served with mismatched forks and unexpected tenderness. Yes, the saloon meal wasn't glamorous, but it spoke of survival. It was heavy and hot. It remembered the hands that prepped it and gave men, if only briefly, a sense of home in places built more of promise than permanence. And it served another noble purpose. It soaked up exactly enough alcohol to get a man back on his horse without misplacing the ground. So next time you picture the Western Saloon, don't just see the spun cylinder of a revolver or the shuffle of aces against Greenfeld. Picture a chipped ceramic plate holding biscuits you could use to disarm a burglar, a gravy so thick it had ambitions, and a room full of stories told between spoonfuls. The truth is, many a man walked into a saloon for whiskey, but more than a few stayed for the stew. Now, as the lanterns flicker low and the scent of burnt coffee drifts softly into the starry hush, let's follow the fading clink of plates and bootsteps. There's still more to uncover, deeper into the warmth behind the bar, where chairs creak with quiet deals, and velvet shadows whisper what menus never say out loud. As dusk slid like warm molasses over the western frontier, saloons became lantern-lit anchors in the dust-blown towns of the 1800s. Flickering gaslight danced across bottles of Kentucky's most questionably diluted bourbon. And the air, well, the air held the unmistakable bouquet of sweat, smoke, and the faint optimism of a man who'd just found an unguarded game of Pharaoh. But if one wandered in thinking saloons were simply about booze and broads, as so many did, they'd be missing the subtler, quieter motivations beneath the mustache wax and poker chips. Because, dear listener, not all payments at the bar were monetary, and not all deals involved cards. Let's now turn our lantern light toward one of the least sung, most underappreciated assets of the Old West Saloon, the newspaper rack. Yes, you heard that rightly. Amid the clamor of piano chords and the soft rustling of crinoline skirts, patrons could be found hunched over the Cheyenne Daily Leader or Tombstone Epitaph, carefully sounding out headlines by spelling each word under their whiskey breath. For many, these papers were their only lifeline to a world beyond the town's muddy main street. They came not only for drink, but to read, or be read to, often by the barmaid who chose pity over poker that day. And then there were the barbers. Oh yes, tucked in a quiet corner, or awkwardly crammed into backrooms next to broom closets, many saloons had what they generously called gentlemen's parlors, where for a few dollars, one might procure a shave, a haircut, and the loss of several layers of dignity. That straight razor wasn't just a grooming tool. It was your barber's solemn promise not to sneeze mid-stroke. What were men really paying for? The illusion of civilization. A shave and a haircut brought more than cleanliness. It was a fragile, foamy reminder that civilization hadn't altogether forgotten them. And while the cut might be a touch uneven, and the barber might reuse towels with a casual disregard for hygiene, there was dignity in sitting upright in that chair the way your father once had, back in a town with stone sidewalks and real churches. Many saloons offered baths too, provided you didn't mind sharing water with people whose hygiene philosophies were largely theoretical. Tin tubs were dragged out, hot water carried by the bucketful, and for 25 cents, a hefty sum, you could soak the dust off from your travels. For a little extra, you might rent a towel, though you'd be wise not to ask about its previous adventures. But perhaps the most peculiar transaction taking place echoed not with revelry, but with the crisp click of inked stamps. Because, dear friend, some saloons doubled as post offices. Think about it. Where better to intercept your mail than the one place everyone went? Between sips of rotgut and curses over crooked dice, you could collect a letter from home, or a stern reminder from your landlord in Baltimore, or perhaps the long-awaited word that your cousin finally struck. Silver, though, suspiciously, he'd written that same thing the year before. Now, let's spare a thought for the traveling salesman who often congregated at the bar not to drink, but to trade. Not goods, necessarily, but gossip. See, the frontier mail system had a rather laissez-faire concept of timeliness, but gossip moved with the speed of a spooked Mustang. Who was building a rail spur? Who'd gotten married? Who'd run off with the mayor's buggy and never looked back? The saloon, then, was not so much a den of sin as it was a rotating carousel of human need. The need to be clean, the need to be seen, and the deep, gnawing need to not feel quite so alone, in a place where wolves howled and mail came by freight. And every pair of spurred boots stepping into a saloon brought another story. Another soul hoping to be part of the great unreliable novel that was the American West. So while the fiddle played and the whiskey poured, and the occasional bar brawl toppled a seat chair or two, it was these quieter moments, the reading of a dusty letter or the shaving of a week's worth of trail, that whispered the truth between gulps of beer and dreams of gold. It was never just about the drink. Let's let the piano trail off into starlight now. And in the next breath, we'll draw the curtain back on a most misunderstood figure of the saloon, the piano player. Not all keys were black and white after all. As the wind whispered through the wooden slats of the saloon's swinging doors, another misunderstood mystery of the Western saloon begins to unfold. One far less boisterous than the usual brawling, boot-stomping tales, but far more illuminating. You see, for all the talk of whiskey shots, poker games, and the occasional outlaws trying their hand at poetry, yes, that happened. An underrated commodity was changing hands right under everyone's mustachioed noses. Personal identity. Yes, the very fabric of one's frontier name and reputation could be purchased, traded, buffed, or rebranded over a strong drink and the right amount of agreeable strangers. Let's set the wooden stage. It's 1883, and you've trudged 3 dusty days through the sagebrush with one pair of socks and a pocketful of exaggerated stories. When you finally stumble into a saloon, hat askew and boots foamy with sweat, you may not want to be Jedediah Humpleton III anymore. You might want to be something spicier, something like Diamond Jack Silverado or Fire Whistle McCoy. And the beauty of the saloon was, no one would argue with you. Saloon houses were, in many cases, where men cashed in the past and gambled on a shinier present. Names weren't just names, they were inventory. Reputation, that slippery bar of soap in the bathhouse of history, could be purchased in spades through a carefully bought round of drinks and the theatrical retelling of a fake but satisfying railroad heist. A man might walk into the Diamond Spur Saloon in Abilene as plain old Walter Finch and emerge, 2 bourbons later, as Texas Walter, the man who once punched a rattlesnake into a hatbox. And no one would bat an eye. The bartender may even nod, knowingly. A few cowboys at the corner table might lean in and mutter, "He's the one I told you about." Of course, this commerce of mythology was unofficial. There wasn't a price list nailed to the wall advertising, "New identity, $2, includes slight limp and mysterious backstory." Yet, in a landscape where few records followed a man west of the Mississippi, and even fewer were accurate, saloons became the warm, whiskey-soaked petri dishes of personal reinvention. It also helped that many towns saw such a rotating cast of characters that no one had time for background checks. Barkeeps weren't asking for papers. They were asking whether your coin was real, or if it jingled like it was meant to. And then there were the barkeepers themselves, the original social media managers. Think of them as the Old West mix of therapist, witness protection agent, and myth perpetuator. A good bartender knew your invented life, and if you tipped well, he'd never let the truth slip. If you tipped even better, he'd add a flourish to your legend. Perhaps Texas Walter didn't just survive the rattlesnake bite, but trained the snake to retrieve playing cards from under the table. Few places in history have offered such a rapid, rum-blurred path to redefinition. It was like joining a new school every week and getting to pick your own nickname without any parental supervision. There's a reason why Pinkerton detectives had such a hard time locating suspects in the West. Everyone was an alias, wrapped in a story and varnished with whiskey. And just like that, entire new identities blossomed like cacti with extra bravado. Gunfighters sometimes had 3 aliases apiece, each more flamboyant than the last. Some even carried different revolvers to use under their different guises. There were quiet dudes who called themselves Doc, knowing full well they'd never even stitched a sock, let alone a wound. But it worked, because people wanted legends to be true. All of this only fed the atmosphere of the saloon, not merely a place for leisure, but the very hearth of collective imaginative reinvention. A kind of chaotic theatre, minus the footlights, but rich with props, mahogany bars, dusty floors, harmonica ballads, and the aroma of whatever passed for food behind the curtain. People weren't just buying drinks in these saloons. They were buying belief. Belief in who they could pretend to be. Belief that somewhere in this swirling haze of cigar smoke, misremembered poker debts, and amber firelight, they might become a figure worth remembering, or at least not someone they used to be. And so, with reputations freshly flipped and stories tall as water towers, men wandered back out into the night, lanterns swaying in the wind and boots, whispering along plank sidewalks. The saloon doors creaked closed behind them, concealing that peculiar Western alchemy of truth, lies, and liquored-up possibility. And as we softly leave this realm of dusty disguises and reinvention, we tiptoe toward another curious corner of saloon life, one that smelled suspiciously of mint, and not for the reason you might think. By the time the sun had dipped beneath the jagged horizon and bathed the prairie in a warm, ruddy glow, Western saloon houses came alive, not just with cigarette smoke and the plaintive wail of a badly tuned piano, but with something altogether more unexpected, the unmistakable scent of soap. Yes, delightful dreamer. Soap. Because despite what dime novels and Clint Eastwood films might suggest, saloons weren't only about gunfights, gambling, and questionable decisions over a whiskey glass. In fact, for many weary cowpokes and dusty railhoppers, saloons offered something downright thrilling in the late 1800s. A warm bath. Or at least, whatever counted as a bath when soap met bucket and dignity went out the swinging doors. Out back, or sometimes tucked behind a thick curtain beyond the card tables, lounged the saloon's lesser-known treasure, the bath chamber, a mismatched enamel tub, dented and slightly listing to one side, cradled a few inches of water that had been courageously warmed over a curious collection of fire hazards. And for the going rate of around 25 cents, no small fee for a ranch hand who hadn't seen silver in a fortnight, a man could strip off a month's worth of trail dust and sink into what locals optimistically called a plunge. This was, after all, a time when bathing was as seasonal as planting, a rare indulgence afforded only when the stink became tactical. Travel-size shampoo, a bowl of cucumber slices, or heavenly bath bombs. These luxuries hadn't yet been imagined. Instead, bath time was accompanied by a bar of soap, mysterious in origin and determined in texture, a block of lye-laced stubbornness that could double as a weapon in a pinch. Some enterprising saloons even offered hot towel rub-downs for an additional nickel, a service provided not necessarily by a trained masseuse, but by Joe, whose primary qualifications consisted of strong forearms and a vague understanding of hygiene. One grizzled regular in Deadwood once described the sensation as being wiped down by a wet raccoon with anger issues. But still, he tipped. In truth, bath services were part of a larger, rarefied offering among saloons, known quaintly as grooming amenities, a curious nod to civility amidst the chaos. Men could also get their boots shined, beards trimmed, and if they remained upright long enough, their hats reblocked. The result? A cowboy who rode into town crusty and creaking like an old barn door might ride out smelling faintly of lavender oil, if the bathhouse madam had a flair for the herbal. In larger towns, competition among saloons gave rise to downright luxurious bathing quarters. Marble floors, or more often, floors painted to resemble marble, ornate brass taps that were sometimes just painted wooden knobs, and bath attendants in pristine aprons made some establishments feel like old West versions of modern spas, with the mild caveat that gunfire was still a very real possibility. And to be clear, not all bath time experiences were created equal. In more rustic outposts, the bath was more a metaphor than a reality, consisting of a communal tub that was filled once a day, to be used by patrons in order of arrival. First bather enjoyed a lukewarm luxury, second bather endured a slightly murkier soak. By the time the seventh guest stepped in, well, let's just say, that's when God invented cold rinses and low expectations. Still, the allure of a proper scrub went beyond cleanliness. For many men of the West, that bath was an act of transformation, a ritual that scraped away not just the dirt of the trail, but the relentless sameness of life on the edge of nowhere. One missive written by a traveling peddler in 1879 described his first saloon bath in Cheyenne as a symphony of civilization, soap bubbles, and the steady thump of piano keys played by a woman named Clara whose hands smelled like pine. And isn't that something? It's strange, really, what we think people wanted in saloons: whiskey, women, and a good fistfight, when sometimes what they paid for most gladly was the luxury of being clean. Even if that clean lasted all of 16 minutes and was promptly undone by the saloon's own cigar ash and sticky floorboards. But tomorrow always came. The world would get dusty again, or the cattle would kick, or the card table would call. And when they did, the bath would wait, steamy and sure in the back room, next to a forgotten boot drying on a peg. Now, just ahead, we peek past the swinging doors once more. Not for a bath, but for something far more musical, the curious, tender world of saloon piano players, those unsung poets of ragtime and rowdiness. But that's a gentle clink of notes for a very sleepy ear. In some saloons, you could get a glass of whiskey, a hot meal, your boots shined, a tooth pulled, a letter scribbled for your sweetheart, and a haircut with a side of gossip, all before noon, without ever stepping outside. And no one would have thought that strange in the slightest. But let's pause here, in the shadowed parlor corners of a typical Western saloon, where things grew a bit trickier and, surprisingly, domestic. You see, the myth paints these establishments as wild, whiskey-splashed dens of debauchery. And yes, there were spittoons, card cheats, and an occasional banjo duel. But, like a pie crust that's just a little too flaky, the rough exterior often crumbled to reveal something softer underneath. Many saloons were just as much about comfort as they were chaos, especially if you had a few extra coins jingling in your pocket, because then, and only then, you could enter the back rooms. Ah, yes, the mysterious back rooms. Candlelit, quilt-draped, sometimes silken, and not strictly what the dime novels would have you believe. Now, certainly, some of these rooms were used for what we shall gently call horizontal recreation, but more often than not, the actual commodity being paid for was time, and conversation, and the smell of coffee that hadn't been boiled into tar. Picture a lonesome ranch hand stumbling into town after months of talking to cows and drinking boiled beans. He doesn't want to fight. He wants a warm bath, clean sheets, and someone with a full set of teeth to ask him how his day's been. Enter the back room. Many saloons, especially in larger towns like Dodge City or Deadwood, had arrangements with women who, contrary to some expectations, weren't always, or even often, prostitutes. These women were commonly called crib-eye girls, parlor girls, or less charmingly, hurdy-gurdy girls, though the term shifted depending on region, wage, and whether or not someone was properly wearing socks. The hurdy-gurdy girls got their odd nickname from a type of musical entertainment they were once associated with, though by the 1870s, most had never seen a hurdy-gurdy instrument in their lives. Instead of cranking out tunes, they cranked out hours, dancing with minors at pay-by-the-minute rates or sharing long talks over watered-down whiskey. Think of it like 19th century speed dating, if speed dating involved stampede stories and the occasional gun on the table. These women were talented conversationalists, part host, part confidant, and part stand-in sweetheart, though no contracts were signed and hearts were seldom spared. Many were immigrants, some with education far beyond their clientele. There are recorded accounts of girls who'd studied literature or music in Europe, only to find themselves discussing prairie dust and fishhook injuries with a gentleman in desperate need of someone to listen. The pay wasn't extravagant, but it was consistent. And in a world where women's work was judged harshly and limited often to laundry and loneliness, being a saloon girl gave a peculiar kind of power. A strange, corseted sort of independence. Though they had to endure both judgments and dangers, many still preferred this life to domestic servitude, or marrying a man who owned 1,000 acres of land but didn't believe in bathing. And the men? Well, plenty weren't after romance or adventure. They were after normalcy. A parlor girl might play piano, pour you a cup of something vaguely resembling tea, and ask about your mother back in Ohio. In return, you'd hand over a week's wages without hesitation, because nowhere else in town offered that kind of momentary normal. As midnight blurred into morning, reality softened into something dreamier in the amber glow of oil lamps. Grizzled prospectors sipped warm cider with Latvian girls named Ilsa. Railroad workers swapped stories with women named Maybelle, who'd quote Shakespeare with alarming accuracy. And somewhere, someone was learning that sometimes the most valuable thing in a saloon wasn't whiskey, it was kindness. Of course, not all establishments offered such niceties. In some, your drink came with a side of broken furniture and an urgent dental crisis, but we'll wander there soon enough, into the wilder branches of beverage-based bravado. As the swinging saloon doors creaked shut behind weather-beaten travelers, a curious transformation unfolded. The dusty exteriors of Western saloons, often slapped together with more optimism than lumber, weren't exactly architectural marvels. But step inside and suddenly you were in a whole new world, one filled with flickering gaslight glow, worn velvet drapes, and mysterious bottles whose labels had long given up the fight against time. Now, most folks imagine saloons were all about whiskey gulps and six-shooters. But here's a sleepy little secret history doesn't always whisper. Much of what men were paying for inside those dim, smoky corridors had less to do with the liquor and more to do with the illusion of refinement. A curious craving for civilization, sprouting right in the middle of horse manure and cactus punch. You see, a man could wrangle cattle all day, get sunstroke twice before noon, eat a lunch that was mostly gravel, and still, by dusk, he'd dig out his coins for an evening of, well, a slightly wobbly attempt at sophistication. Take the piano, for instance. Oh, the piano. How many nights were softened by the clunk and clatter of an out-of-tune upright that had been dragged across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain, sometimes strapped to a mule, sometimes to a very reluctant wife. The fact that many of those pianos sounded like a bucket of skeletons didn't matter. What mattered was the presence of the piano itself. It was a totem of culture, a musical mirage suggesting that the man sipping warm whiskey out of a chipped glass was, if only for a few minutes, a patron of the arts. And then there were the chandeliers, glorious constructions of dubious quality, cow bones painted gold, glass shards pretending to be crystal, or just bundles of candles suspended by rope and hope. Why install something that could set the whole building ablaze if sneezed on too enthusiastically? Because it sparkled. It added a touch of elegance to a room otherwise reeking of sweat, gunpowder, and a decade of spilled dreams. But perhaps one of the most enchanting services on offer to the weary customer had nothing to do with booze or women or card tables bitter from defeat. It was conversation. Now, one must remember, in frontier towns, meaningful conversation was a rare and treasured thing. Days were long, solitary affairs, filled with hard labor, harsh elements, and people who mostly communicated in grunts and suspicious nods. So, to walk into a saloon and be greeted by someone who looked you in the eyes, offered a kind word or a joke so old it had fossilized, was worth a pretty penny. Enter the saloon waitress. Not necessarily glamorous, though some certainly were. Some had city accents they kept polished like their boots, while others could trap flies with their stare. But all of them were performers, in their own soft and subtle way. They learned their patrons' names, how they took their drinks, the names of their horses, and whether they preferred songs about longing or winnings. They were, in many ways, frontier therapists, armed with aprons instead of diplomas. And let's not forget the theatre acts. Yes, for the price of a drink or two, men could watch astonishing displays, often involving a woman in a feathered hat belting out a song about lost love, or a man attempting to juggle rattlesnakes, ill-advised but always memorable. Saloon. Stages were small, but ambitions were grand. Vaudeville thrived here, between whiskey refills and thunderstorms. Even the walls got in on the act. Some saloons were decorated with wallpaper, actual printed wallpaper, that had been shipped by boat and borrowed train, costing more than the building itself. Why? Because it transported people, just for a moment, away from the clang of picks and the bitter cold of prairie dusk, and into some far-off parlor in Boston or Lyon, or wherever dreams were wallpapered in Paisley. So despite the rough and tumble reputation, much of what men paid for in these saloons was not a product, but an atmosphere. A possessed spell of civilization, stitched together from cheap stage curtains and dreams forged under lantern light. They weren't just buying beer, they paid for belonging, paid for warmth, paid to feel like more than just a dusty speck in an endless land. And as the puckered old piano stumbled into its final high note for the evening, and the lantern flames bowed softly to the careful hush of midnight, a gentle promise carried through the rafters. Somewhere deep inside this bare country, you could still pretend, if only for a while, that you were part of something grander. Soon, under the faded stars and the creaking woodboards of yet another wind-blown evening, one curious business inside these saloons began to pour unexpected coins into the tills, and it had absolutely nothing to do with whiskey. The piano was out of tune. It always was, especially after it had playfully lost yet another leg to a drunken scuffle or a spontaneous dance upon its tabletop. Still, there it stood in dusty gallantry near the corner of the saloon, eternally hopeful, like someone who keeps opening their window in January, thinking maybe today will be spring. Now, you might imagine the piano was merely decorative, just another part of the scenery, like the sad old moosehead above the bar or the spittoon that doubled as a conversation piece. But no, music filled a very specific and highly valued purpose in the saloon economy. Not just the primitive tinkling of ivory, but the evocative, mood-setting, wallet-loosening art of performance. Enter the saloon pianist, often an underpaid maestro of suspicious background and even more suspicious hygiene. Despite their modest circumstances, these pianists wielded untold power. A slow, melancholic melody could usher in a bittersweet longing that made the poker players drink double and tip carelessly. A quick ragtime number could cause an entire room to forget their losses at the faro table and instead line up for another whiskey. See, far from being background noise, this was strategy, sonic manipulation with a dash of flair, an early form of soundtracking consumption long before the word brand experience darkened anyone's doorstep. But the music wasn't performed in isolation. Oh no. Hovering nearby, gracefully where possible, shuffling professionally where required, were the entertainers, the dance hall girls. These were not your typical can-can lineup as seen in modern Western movies, all synchronized legs and stiff smiles. No, these were savvy and often well-read women who functioned as conversation artists, social magicians, and economic pickaxes. Most weren't sex workers in the way popular myths would suggest. In fact, many worked under strict, no-touch policies enforced by house madams whose eyebrows alone could correct undesirable behavior faster than a sheriff's six-shooter. What these women actually traded in was attention, the kind of rapturous listening that made even the most weather-beaten cowboy feel like he was the only man in the West who had successfully wrestled a coyote into submission with sheer charisma. Paying for a drink with a dance hall girl wasn't just buying a dance, it was renting the feeling of success. For the cost of a whiskey times two, one for her, one for him. A miner could imagine she was genuinely impressed by his pickaxe technique. A rail worker could pretend she really did want to hear about the time he fought off a prairie dog with a spoon. Their job was to look like they belonged in velvet, while pretending they were awed by tobacco-stained stories. It was theatre. It was retail affection. It was emotional companionship on a flickering wick of lamp oil. You might wonder, did these men know it was all an act? Of course. But sleep makes fools of us all. And so does loneliness. To protect the illusion, saloons employed house rules. The more successful ones kept their dance girls in respectable boarding houses with early curfews, though early, in a frontier town, could mean just before sunrise. Some saloons even printed rule cards: no touching, no leering, 1 dance per drink. Romantic heartbreak was inevitable, but highly regulated, sometimes written down in paragraph 9 of the drink menu. There were other musical instruments too: violins, guitars, even the occasional trumpet, but few could rival the piano for its perfect blend of noise and nostalgia. Pianists became adept at sensing the room's emotional weather. Lose too many customers to a losing hand of blackjack. Switch to an upbeat reel. Sheriff just got caught kissing the mayor's wife. Time for a sleepy ballad to distract the laughter. And then there were the hired hands. Guys whose job was not to keep peace, but to stir just enough chaos to make the drinks flow faster. When the pianist hit those familiar opening notes, they'd start a carefully curated bit of banter. A whisper of a gold strike at a nearby creek, a wager on which travel preacher had the best beard, or, most popular of all, a staged argument over who cheated whom at euchre in '76, all accompanied by music, smiling women, artificial smiles, and whiskey you could use to bleach laundry. So, next time you think saloons were about swinging doors and cheap gin, remember, they were Western Broadway. Somewhere between a social experiment and a sensory trap, orchestrated by a man with 12 fingers and a dance partner named Mabel, who knew 2 languages and 3 ways to feign amusement. As the rattling notes of that unwell piano drift off into the wood-smoked air, let's follow their trail. There's a darker room just beyond the gambling tables. And what went on in there? Well, that had very little to do with cards, and everything to do with silence. Imagine, if you will, a dusty western town near midnight, stars hanging loosely over the sagging wooden rooftops, the scent of horses mingling with cigar smoke, and a gentle piano melody leaking through the bat-wing doors of the local saloon. Inside, the lamplight glows amber on poker chips. Spittoons reflect glimmers like miniature moons, and somewhere in a back corner, someone is snoring in a chair meant only for the conscious. Now, up until this point, you may have assumed the saloon was just a place to drink bourbon, play cards, and occasionally launch a bar stool in the direction of a man named Lefty. But tonight, let's delicately creak open a side door in our minds and step into something far more aerophile. Domestic. Laundry. Yes, laundry. Slightly damp, questionably cleaner, and often fluttering above poker tables like spectral flags of surrender. You see, in many frontier saloons, particularly those not graced with the booming population of larger towns, the barkeep wasn't just juggling whiskey bottles and breaking up brawls, he was also managing the lodge's unofficial laundromat. Because what does a punchy cowboy want after a week hauling cattle through sagebrush? Well, a drink. But right after that, a decent shirt. Preferably one that didn't smell like dried beans and prairie regret. Some saloons, especially those with upper stories or side rooms, were operated by entrepreneurial widows or otherwise formidable women who provided actual wash and fold services. They'd take your crusted up chaps, your soot-stiff socks, and if you were particularly charming, maybe your undershirt too, all in exchange for a few coins or favors. You could drop them off in the morning, spend the afternoon losing at blackjack, and by sundown, voila cleaner clothes and a solid whiff of lye soap. Of course, these services weren't always advertised with a sign. A subtle conversation in the corner, a nod exchanged after someone asked for a thread check, a common code for both mending and gossip, was often all it took. Try not to picture a saloon full of half-clothed men waiting around in their long johns. Actually, wait. Go ahead. Who are we to interfere with your creativity? And make no mistake, this wasn't some dainty side hustle. Laundry was back-breaking labor. Heating water took forever, especially in towns where firewood was hoarded like gold bars. Then came the scrubbing, on washboards, on rocks, on whatever flat surface someone wasn't already sitting on. After that, wringing everything out like you were punishing it for misbehavior. If clothing could talk in the 1800s, it would scream during laundry day. Now, the real masterpiece was drying space. In desert regions, your clothes were stiff as parchment in no time, which made wearing them again feel a bit like climbing into corrugated tin. But in wetter climates, or during miserable winters, drying turned into an elaborate indoor ballet. Ropes were strung above the bar, across the sleeping quarters, even zigzagged above the piano. Regular patrons knew better than to stand up too fast, lest they find themselves face first in someone else's pantaloons. You might think all this chaos detracted from the saloon's ambience. Strangely, it didn't. In fact, many cowhands found the scent of steaming laundry oddly comforting. After weeks out on the open plains, any trace of citrus lye or warm fabric was a gentle, ghostly echo of something like home. And the saloon keepers didn't mind, either. A clean shirt made a man stay longer. A mended sock might encourage him to ante in for another hand. Every piece of fresh laundry was another invisible tether, keeping vagabonds anchored to the bar just a little while longer. In time, some saloons went a step further, offering tiny packages of scent salts tucked within bundles of neatly folded garments. Rose hips, mint leaves, even stolen sachets from traveling preachers' wives found their way into the seams. Cowboys couldn't always put their finger on it, but putting their shirt back on after these services felt like winning a round of poker against life itself. So the next time you romanticize the saloon as just bullets, bourbon, and belly laughs, remember this. It was also fabric softener, line-dried linens, and the gentle, endless rhythm of rinse and repeat. And just beyond the wash line, where the shadows stretch tall and the lamp oil thins, something else entirely is waiting to be discovered. There was a particular moment in many saloons, sometime after the third glass of dubious whiskey, and right before a man's sense of dignity called it a night, when someone would exclaim, usually in a loud, overconfident drawl, "I'll take 5 minutes with the professor." And no, dear dreamer, this was not the start of an impromptu lecture on metaphysics over poker chips and cigar smoke. This was code. And tonight, we unlock perhaps one of the oddest corners of the Old West Saloon experience, the curious case of the in-house entertainment experts. Because behind the jingle of spurs and the warble of piano keys, many saloons hosted a variety of characters offering services, intellectual, mystical, and sometimes questionably hygienic. While you may think saloons were simply about drinks, cards, and questionable dance choreography, many of them doubled, sometimes tripled, as centers of information, amusement, and very peculiar education. Enter the Professor. Professor was a popular title in bustling towns like Deadwood, Tombstone, and Dodge City, though the title rarely suggested an actual academic background. In fact, in quartz-veined mining towns, you didn't need a diploma to earn the name. You just had to own a deck of tarot cards, 3 good stories, or preferably, a beard long enough to store secrets. The professor might be a traveling phrenologist. Ah, yes, phrenology, the pseudo-scientific pursuit of reading bump maps on a person's scalp like it was a rocky topography of intentional design. Customers, for the price of a round or two, could sit in an awkward wooden chair while the professor tenderly prodded their noggins with solemn assurance. He'd mutter. You have a well-developed bump of benevolence. Suggests you're a generous lover. Bad with money. Probable gambling problem, but excellent bone structure. It was a sort of Wild West horoscope, and just about as scientifically sound. Others labeled as professors were mesmerists. They'd gaze into your eyes and attempt to hypnotize you, or at least lull you into a stupor long enough to get you to buy their homemade elixir, which typically included generous quantities of alcohol and just a kiss of opium. If someone bragged about cleaning up their soul at the saloon, chances are it was mostly internal disinfection in the form of laudanum. And then, of course, were the musical professors, traveling pianists who carried worn sheet music and a repertoire built for raucous rebellion. They played faster than the speed of sobering up and could launch into Stuttgart waltzes or ragtime reels, depending on how many shots deep the audience was. These gentlemen, and occasionally unusually talented ladies in bowler hats, could earn as much in tips in one evening as a schoolteacher made in a month. Which was easy, considering schoolteachers were famously paid in potatoes, candles, or the heartfelt thanks of underwashed children. Not to be outdone, some saloons claimed their own resident natural philosophers. They spoke in florid, overly dramatic monologues about the origin of man, the future of steam-powered everything, and why the moon was probably angry with us. These professors hosted salons inside saloons, yes, salons in saloons, where cigars met soft Socratic inquiry. Argument was expected, enlightenment optional, and it wasn't just novelty professors who drew a crowd. The more flamboyant the production, the better. Some barkeeps hired mentalists who could guess your age by the way you walked, or your birthday by the way you sipped whiskey. In retrospect, they were probably just excellent at reading tipsy people and possibly smelled birthdays on their breath. It's worth noting that intelligence, or what passed for it, was a hot saloon commodity. The wild frontier was noisy, rowdy, and bleakly uncertain. People clung to predictions, philosophies, and illusions the way we cling to Wi-Fi signals on a road trip. Professor, scribbling indecipherable notes and making eye contact with alarming intensity, offered a glimpse of order in an otherwise chaotic world. So when customers paid for 5 minutes with the professor, they weren't just buying nonsense. They were spending a few deeply satisfying moments in a fantasy where knowledge felt like a magic trick, tailored just for them. And after all, isn't that what many of us secretly crave on our more restless nights? A charming distraction, a bit of faux wisdom, and someone who tells us that our bump of benevolence is truly exceptional. Now, as the final piano note fades and the professor packs up his arcane tools, or maybe just his flask, let's wander a little deeper into the saloon's back room, where the chime of silverware and laughter suggests a secret supper club of sorts, with food that's questionably edible, but stories that are deliciously unforgettable, as dusk spilled like warm molasses across the dusty main streets of Tombstone, Deadwood, and every other town that sounded like a Halloween decoration. The saloons came to life with that peculiar mix of revelry and resignation. Lamps flickered, piano keys danced like nervous ponies, and men who'd spent the daylight hours trying not to die now found themselves paying for something far more elusive than drink or company. They were paying for reassurance, and maybe just a smidge of manufactured importance. You see, behind the bat-wing doors and the clinking glasses, saloon houses had mastered the art of creating illusion. Not just illusions of daring card games and swirling skirts, but illusions of identity. A temporary one, mind you, but a powerful one all the same. It was the facial hair. Suddenly, every man with a handlebar moustache and a dusty duster coat was transformed into someone worthwhile. Saloons offered not only drinks, but the intoxicating idea that your rough hands meant something, and your story mattered, even if you never got past the second chorus of it before falling off your bar stool. And speaking of stories, the wide-mouthed barkeep was often the keeper of many. He knew what each man had lost in the war, or claimed to have lost. He knew which ranchers were bluffing, which gamblers were brilliant, and which lawmen were one bad week away from joining the outlaws. But most importantly, he knew how to nod solemnly at a man who whispered, "She ran off with a fiddler," or "The gold dried up in Cripple Creek," or, on Wednesdays, both. There's a rather sleepy charm to discovering that most patrons weren't paying just for beer. They could get that in a barrel if they wanted. They were paying for ritual, for the rhythm of familiarity. They paid to walk the same creaky floorboards every night, and to lean across the same worn mahogany bar, where their elbows formed tiny indentations over time, like fossil records of missed opportunities. And yes, they paid for pickled eggs. Let us never forget those. Suspiciously glistening orbs bobbing in cloudy jars offered as proof that the human digestive system is a brave, stubborn thing. You could tell a regular not by the way he dressed, because a cowboy, miner, and conman often shopped at the same store, but by how he tipped his hat to the piano player, how he lit his cigar with a match stuck to the corner of the bar mirror, and how he subtly shifted when the doors creaked, always expecting a debt or bullet to finally arrive. There were other things a man could buy at a saloon, some scandalous, many exaggerated, but nothing got spoken of directly. Language itself became foggy. Some might pay for entertainment, but that term was as generously applied as chicken in a traveling stew. Even the rustle of silk upstairs, audible only between piano pauses, became part of the ambience, unspoken, understood. Every saloon developed its own personality, much like an eccentric great-aunt. Some were raucous and smelled of spilled bourbon and broken dreams, while others had faint delusions of class. Mirrored walls, imported wallpaper, a chandelier that once belonged to a steamboat until the steamboat sank. And there was a peculiar democracy in these establishments. A prospector caked in mud could sit beside a prim man with golden cufflinks and they'd both get overcharged the same. The drinks weren't always strong, but the advice certainly was. There was always that one old-timer, always the one who'd slide his glass toward the edge, peer into it like it held secrets, and announce to no one in particular, "It's not the liquor that bites, it's the way you drink it." Philosophers, all of them. So truly, what were men paying for? Validation, mostly. Proof that they hadn't vanished into the frontier fog, that someone, somewhere, had noticed their boots tracking through the dust, that when the piano played and the dice tumbled, their presence, fleeting though it may be, left a subtle ripple. Because in a world where the future arrived on horseback and no one carried calendars, men clung to ritual like bark on a tree in a storm. And in the cozy hush of a quiet saloon corner, with a cracked glass, a warm chair, and a story falling slowly out of someone's mouth, you could almost forget how much everything outside still hurt. And so, with lamplight flickering low and boots resting easy on the rail, let's drift a bit further. Not just into the next town, but into the humming, still shadowed world of what, precisely, went on upstairs. In the hushed glow of lantern light and sawdust-flecked floorboards, the Western saloon wore many hats, or more accurately, many beards and bonnets. While the popular imagination paints it as a raucous den of drink and dice, the truth is, it served another, often overlooked function: the original Craigslist. You see, when a man pushed open those swinging doors and stepped inside with his boots clacking, he might have been looking for a whiskey, sure, but he might also have been hunting for a dentist. Yes, a dentist. Perhaps also a theatrical performance, a land deed, a steam-powered mousetrap, or a new pair of trousers, used but in acceptable condition. Saloon bulletin boards were among the first informal community centers on the frontier. They didn't call it bourbon and buy-sell trade, but they might as well have. In many towns, especially those scarcely large enough to support a sheriff with matching boots, the saloon doubled as post office, barbershop, community hall, and informal customer complaint department, usually resolved with a stern look and a shotgun. It was where miners found blacksmiths, ranchers found fence builders, and itinerant salesmen of dubious legitimacy found, well, clients with a relaxed view of guarantees. Imagine the town of Gravel Gulch, a forgettable stain on the map with two things going for it: a decent water source and a barkeep named Clem who moonlighted as the town tax collector. On Tuesdays after supper, Clem would tack notices to the barrel near the bar. Horace's mule is missing. Again, willing to trade 40 spoiled eggs for one window pane. Or occasionally, in more enterprising handwriting, seeking bride, living room recently swept. Now and then, whole performances would unfold in these dusty venues. Not just musical trios hopping through lively banjo tunes, but very small traveling acting troupes, sometimes composed entirely of one person and two puppets. They'd reenact Shakespeare, loosely, or tell tales of sea voyages none of the audience had ever seen, complete with sound effects made by stomping on cracker barrels and whacking tin with a ladle. To these frontier folk, entertainment was not just a luxury, it was proof that they were still human, that their lives were not entirely consumed by cattle, floods, and those impossibly dense biscuits Aunt Eustace made every year for Christmas. 40% of the patrons couldn't read, but they'd still happily watch someone pretend to read Dickens dramatically from behind a half-empty pickle barrel. More than just shows, the saloon was a marketplace of ideas, especially bad or questionable ones. A man named Hezekiah once delivered an impromptu lecture entitled "How to Harvest Lightning in a Jug Using Only 2 Cats and a Stovepipe." No one ever tried it again, mostly because of what happened to the cats. But not all ideas were so ill-fated. The saloon was the best place in town to drum up enthusiasm for new civic endeavors. Want to build a church? Get everyone around and pass the hat? Want to start a newspaper? Find the drunk with ink-stained fingers and the loudest opinions. One prosperous errand run ended with 3 miners and a mule accidentally founding their own self-governing township after someone misheard an auction bid. And inevitably, there, among all that exchange of beer and barter, you'd find a social courtship that was entirely sober in its intent, even if not in execution. Romance bloomed amid the cigar smoke and half-crooked piano melodies. Don't let the ruffled skirts and sly fans fool you. Many a respectable marriage began right there, on a beer-soaked floor, between two people shouting barely comprehensible pleasantries over the din of a fiddle. So no, the average saloon boy wasn't merely plunking coins down for the chance to be tossed out by a surly bartender. He was investing in society, in commerce, in the occasional hand-painted map or suspiciously good meat pie sold by a man who claimed to have once seen a cougar. Sleepy little microeconomies sprouted like tumbleweeds rolled in cash receipts. And nowhere was this more evident than during the weekly saloon swap, wherein patrons offered up random treasures, buttons, teeth, and once, a very fine hat that unfortunately came with a raccoon still sleeping inside. But what these places truly sold wasn't just drink or distraction. They offered that warm, humming sense of connection, a quilt of human oddities stitched together in wood, whiskey, and wit. And as we settle into the straw-stuffed hush of twilight, you might wonder, as the fire crackles low, what of the women who served behind those swinging doors? Their roles, too, were far more layered than legend suggests. But that, dear listener, is a story best uncorked next. Somewhere between the jangling of spurs and the soft clunk of a whiskey glass on varnished pine, the Old West Saloon offered an underrated service. Not brawls, not bawdy piano, and not even the questionable stew. No, dear listener, what many patrons quietly sought in these dusty sanctuaries was mail. Yes, mail, letters, parcels, packages, a whole postal strategy neatly tucked behind the bar of some saloons. Now, that's not something John Wayne movies ever bothered to show. But picture it, a hardened cowboy, weather-beaten from 12 straight days in the saddle, loping toward his usual haunt, not just for whiskey or a warm smile, but for a letter from his sister in Missouri, or a crumpled envelope holding his deed, or the monthly reminder that his mother still said prayers for him nightly. The saloon keeper, among his many unofficial jobs, therapist, bail bondsman, amateur undertaker, also served as a sort of local postmaster, especially in towns that were still nothing more than ambition and bad handwriting on a map. No formal post office. No problem. The saloon would do. And so you'd often see a bulletin board or cubby system behind the bar, tagged with names and dry rotted string. Mail sorted alongside whiskey orders and bar tabs. You must understand, most men in those towns didn't have a permanent address. They were drifting, as they poetically like to say, homesteading 1 month, prospecting the next, then wrangling cattle across half the continent. But the one constant in their meandering abstract, schedules. The saloon back in town. That was the anchor. More than church or jail, the saloon was the center of gravity. A man might not have a home, but he sure as shootin' had a bar stool. Some saloon keepers encouraged it. In fact, if they knew which customers were regulars, they'd make a show of handing over important letters as part of the ritual. Got something for you, Jim, from Sacramento. These letters were familial, financial, foolish, or all three. Some led to tears, others to elation, still others to awkward disappearances. No one quite recovered from unexpectedly learning one's wife had remarried again. Of course, with mail came mischief. In certain rowdier saloons, it wasn't uncommon for more drunken patrons to accidentally borrow someone else's letter, opening it only to discover it was merely a list of debts or a recipe for pickled beets. That's why some bartenders developed a sixth sense for which envelope went to whom. What's more calming than a bartender who knows just how much bourbon you like, and also remembers which flowery envelope comes from your beloved? Now and then, saloon mail systems grew so sophisticated that some barkeeps published their own newsletters. Yes, you heard that right. Bar-based bulletins. Town gossip mixed with practical reminders. There will be a dance at the Grange Hall this Saturday. Please don't bring your revolvers. Or, the Peterson boy is still missing 2 goats. Any information can be left with old Sally behind the bar. Many saloon mailboards also doubled as community message centers. A cowboy might leave a scribbled note pinned to the wall. Tell Caleb I've gone up Dead Man's Ridge. He owes me $2. Tell him I still want it. Or even more cryptic. Gone east. If she asks, I was never here. Not the most responsible way to handle one's social obligations, but certainly the most poetic. And what a tender image it is, isn't it? All those rough-edged men, days between baths, politely asking after their letters. Has anything come for me? They'd mumble, hearts half hoping for good news, half bracing for bad. The barkeep, who'd seen the man lose 4 hands of poker and a good horse last week, gently pulling the envelope from under the bar, tapping the dust off as though it were a sacred relic. Soft moments in hard places. Because under the swagger and the slurred whiskey tunes, there fluttered little paper connections, linking men to families, to dreams, to promises made 3 territories ago. In a place where the wind often howled louder than human voices, a single letter could weigh more than gold dust. And so, across the creaking wooden floorboards and candle-lit whiskey glasses, the saloon became not just a den of drink and dice, but a portal to the past, the future, and places far from the noisy tin of a poker dealer's shuffle. Now that we've opened the mail and gently tucked the envelope back into our saddlebag of stories, it's time we saddle up again, because our journey through the saloon isn't done. Not quite yet. Somewhere past the swinging bat-wing doors, beneath the jangle of spurs, and behind the fading clink of a whiskey glass set too hard on the bar, a different kind of performance unfolded. It came not from the poker table, nor from the occasional barroom brawl that sent chairs flying and tooth gaps widening, but from a stage shrouded in red velvet and gaslight dreams, a place where the art of illusion met the audience just drunk enough to believe. Yes, tonight we tiptoe behind the velvet curtain, because beyond frothy beer and spittoons, another commodity drew wide-eyed patrons into those western saloon houses, and it wasn't ladies of the night, not entirely. It was the gentlemen, or rather, the gentlemen of the night, the magicians, mentalists, snake-oil dramatists, and self-declared clairvoyants, peddling wonders with a smoke flare and a wink. In the late 1800s, many a Western saloon reinvented itself not just as a watering hole, but as a theatre of the odd and marvelous. These were stages not quite Broadway, but not quite barnyard either. Equal parts sawdust and hocus pocus. A favourite act, the great Monticello, no relation to Thomas Jefferson, who performed miracles of the human mind while wearing a moleskin waistcoat and eyes smudged with charcoal for mystique. His signature trick involved bending spoons, which conveniently came from his own collection of pre-softened cutlery. If you clapped at the end, he'd pretend to faint. The audience, kind-hearted and 3 bourbons deep, tended to reward him with coins, incredulous gasps, and occasional buttons. Then there was Madame Lucinda, equal parts spiritualist and stageham. Clad in mourning black, she'd summon dead miners who, through a series of suspiciously pre-scripted knocks, warned the intoxicated crowd to beware of dishonest poker dealers or worse, bad, chilly. Madame Lucinda had a respectable run, particularly as she advertised her seances as guaranteed ghostly, or your money not necessarily refunded. It was all a kind of stage-bound mischief, really. A Western version of Las Vegas before Las Vegas had electricity or enough water not to dehydrate a mule. But the audience didn't mind. In fact, these shows offered a glorious reprieve from the ticking threats outside. Out there were real bullets, real debts, real hunger. In here, a man sawed a woman in half using a painted lumberjack saw, and somehow she giggled more each night. Even saloon owners saw the market in this make-believe economy. By 1880, many Western watering holes employed rotating casts of performers. They were cheaper than piano tuners. They worked for tips, room, and the occasional ham sandwich. Some even doubled as bartenders, pouring drinks with one hand while dramatically producing a bouquet of fake flowers from their sleeve with the other. The drunks loved it. The sober were too few to assess. And occasionally, just occasionally, one of these performers struck such a chord or played such a trick that legends sprung up around them. Word had it there was once a ventriloquist in Tombstone who got into a heated argument with his dummy mid-performance. The audience found it so thrilling they returned nightly to see how the fight would progress. The dummy, for his part, demanded a raise. The ventriloquist fired him. The crowd mourned. 3 weeks later, the dummy came back under a new stage name, Mr. Hardwood. Ticket sales doubled. This was the genius of the saloon. All things could happen beneath its sagging roof. Cowboys cried during puppet shows involving tragic oxen. Bankers cheered when a blindfolded woman correctly guessed the number of coins in a jar, if only because it reminded them of more honest arithmetic. Magic was not just illusion. It was emotional lubrication for a world that ran divots into the soul. And all of this, of course, came with a reminder. These spectacles weren't designed merely to swindle or show off. No, they soothed. Like folk songs and bedtime prayers, they told weary minds that mystery still existed, and laughter could be summoned, on cue, with good lighting. Especially when the drinks were 2 cents extra during showtime. And if you think that was entertaining, wait until you peek inside the world of the most curiously garish and suspiciously aromatic corner of the Western saloon, the barber shop in the back. Something tells me this wasn't just a place for haircuts, but fragrant intrigue and perhaps more pomade than decency would recommend. The saloon had piano music, yes, albeit often played slightly off-key and occasionally halted by the pianist nodding off into his whiskey. But nestled beyond the boisterous card tables and the squeaky piano pedals was something many patrons came to truly treasure. Conversation, yes, conversation. The kind that unfolds as dim oil lamps flicker, and the whiskey glasses sweat in your hand, and time begins to melt into the saloon walls like molasses sliding down a summer porch rail. Now, was it always profound conversation? Not really. Sometimes it was about weather patterns. Occasionally it touched on livestock hygiene, and more often than not, it was a mess of tall tales involving lost gold mines, coyotes with human eyes, and distant cousins who swore they saw Abraham Lincoln riding a buffalo in a dream. But what made this talk so enchanting, and let's say this softly, was the presence of women. Not always the dancehall girls as many imagined, but sometimes proprietresses, cooks, cigar sellers, or the house favorite, the chatty chambermaid who seemed to exist solely to unravel gossip as gracefully as she plucked lint off a waistcoat. Many a man came to sling back bourbon, yes, but somewhere between drink 3 and the kitchen soup of the day, a greyish mystery with hints of bean, they found themselves drawn into the warm gravity of dialogue. And not just any dialogue, a specific breed, impossibly meandering, comforting in its lack of urgency, and full of linguistic detours that made it sound more like a hammock gently swaying in the breeze than a conversation with any real point. These women, often lumped together under the crude term saloon girls, were in reality conversational athletes, equal parts historian, therapist, and amateur astronomer, depending on the client. Many arrived in the West with stories as twisty as the Oregon Trail itself. Some had divorced their husbands, wildly scandalous then. Some had escaped strict New England towns by impersonating nuns or claiming to be cholera nurses. One woman allegedly got her start masquerading as a ghost to scare off gold claim jumpers. Her ghost voice, sadly, didn't pay like gossip did. You see, part of the allure was that these women were unshockable. They'd heard it all. They nodded at wild regrets and tolerated drunken philosophies about railroad stocks and metaphysics. They laughed at jokes, only barely trying to be funny, and they had the patience of 100 monks herding cats. And for men who had spent weeks, if not months, in dust-thick isolation, battling coyotes, blizzards, or the sheer existential horror of bank ledgers, this kind of patient attention was better than gold. Better than the stiff back mattresses at the boarding house. Better than Mama's dried apple pie, even if they'd never say so aloud. Some saloons formalized this whole operation with what was called companion time. This wasn't code for scandalous behavior, mind you. Sometimes it meant someone would just sit with you while you practiced poetry outside your journal, or listen as you explained, passionately, why your mule had the soul of a French composer. And she believed you, or at least she said she did. For a dime extra, she might even nod solemnly and ask for his favorite key signature. It is perhaps one of history's quieter truths that in a place mythologized for shootouts and poker cheats, the true currency was quiet attention, human connection, the warm, non-judgmental space to be heard, even if what you said didn't make much sense, especially if it didn't make much sense. This softer side of the saloon was rarely written down, outshone by the drama of brawls and broken bottles. But beneath the creak of wooden floorboards and behind the heavy velvet curtains, there was a sanctuary of sorts, not just for those looking to escape the cold night or the cold shoulder of fate, but for anyone who just needed a moment to be understood, however briefly, by someone not wearing a badge or holding an axe. And as the candles started to gutter and the last drink was poured, usually into someone's shoe by mistake, the lingering murmurs of those long, rambling talks floated up into the rafters like smoke. Wisps of connection, drifting upward, never written into the official history books, but perhaps more honest than anything bound in leather. And in the soft hush of a saloon inching towards slumber, another unspoken question hung in the amber-drenched air. If you tell someone your story in a dusty wooden room, and they stay awake to hear every word, does it begin to matter more? Now, let's draw the velvet curtain just slightly and peek into another corner of the saloon life, where slippers met splinters and baths were anything but relaxing. By the time dusk spilled golden syrup across the creaky wood facades of a western town, the saloon had already begun to hum. Not roar, not yet. The real mayhem arrived later, usually around the same time someone hollered something about losing a tooth over a poker hand or finding a new one in their spittoon. No, this early hum was more like the town's soul warming up its vocal cords. Inside, the air was a little too thick. Part cigar smoke, part yesterday's spilled whiskey, and maybe just a hint of desperation trapped in a boot heel. Behind the long bar, often hand-carved by someone named Hank, or possibly stolen from the back of a train, stood the bartender. Philosophers in aprons, these men, keepers of secrets, silent referees of arguments, and part-time chemists making medicine for cowboys with broken hearts and possibly hepatitis. But here's something the dime novels rarely emphasized. Aside from the liquor, the gambling, and the high-kicking can-can girls, what men were really paying for inside many saloons was time. Just time. Not in some grand metaphysical sense, though the whiskey did help with that, but time away. Time away from the dust and the debt and the cattle with minds of their own. Time spent pretending to win something, even if it was just a round of cards or the attention of Sally behind the bar with her sly smirk and collection of stories about men who bragged too loud and left too soon. And oh, speaking of cards, gambling wasn't just a sideline, it was the entertainment industry. Professional gamblers, sharp of eye and smoother than the whiskey, often traveled from town to town like troubadours of chance, and just like traveling musicians, they were known by name. Doc Holliday, for one, who, before gathering notoriety at the OK Corral, cut his teeth at faro tables with a derringer tucked in his vest and a chronic cough that could clear a room faster than a shootout. Faro, by the way, was the game of the common cowboy. Faster than poker, easier to rig, and sporting a name one could shout after a few drinks without spraining a tongue. It stayed popular until the late 19th century, when people finally realized the house had better odds than an undertaker in a gold rush. But if you thought saloons were all cards and whiskey, you might be surprised to learn that they were also occasionally cultural centers. And by cultural, we of course mean a spot where a gentleman could sit in a corner and have someone read to him, because he most likely couldn't do it himself. Saloons were sometimes stocked with newspapers, books, and city gossip fresh off the stagecoach. Yes, the world outside the dusty town limits could be accessed between sips of bourbon and bites of questionable beef stew. And speaking of stew, food. A little salt pork in the pot went a long way when your competition across the street only served peanuts and regret. Many saloons tried to attract clientele with free lunch. Of course, the catch was that the lunch was only free if you bought a drink, which you were going to do anyway. But nothing drew a crowd of hungry miners like a boiled egg and a stale biscuit. It worked, too. Business thrived on the promise of free pickles and salted herring. They didn't call them hard times for nothing. But let's not forget the musicians, the plink-plonk piano players who operated somewhere between artistry and mayhem, whether cranking out Camptown races or improvising over the pulse of a bar fight. They played through everything. Occasionally, mid-performance, a man would land head-first on the piano from the upper balcony, and the pianist would pause only long enough to scoot his hat aside before launching into another verse. And though it may seem like a loud, rowdy life, the drinking, the gambling, the dancing, there were always quiet moments too. A man nursing a glass of rye, watching the dust settle outside. A woman backstage, taping up her shoes with frayed ribbon. A barkeep polishing the same glass he swore he'd clean yesterday. It was in those soft pauses that the real saloon magic happened. Because even amidst the crooked games, the gunbelt gossip, and the mirage-like promise of adventure, the Western Saloon was a place where people could simply exist. Not to reach for glory or gold dust, but for the warm buzz of kerosene lamps, the lilt of piano keys on tired ears, and perhaps, if the night was kind, one comforting thing to believe in, if only until the sun came up. And just as the saloon doors swing slowly shut behind us, there is one last shadow yet to explore. Something more elusive than whiskey, more whispered than a winning hand. But we'll ease into that story soon. Gently, like a poker chip sliding across Greenfeld, out in the dusky corners of a western frontier town, where twilight settled dust across wooden porches and sturdy horses politely snored in their hitching posts. The saloon house stood like a glowing lantern in the night. Flickering amber came from its windows, and laughter, or something distantly resembling it, drifted out to join the chirping of crickets and the occasional disgruntled cough from a cattle driver who'd overdone it on baked beans. Inside, well, you already know it wasn't just pistols, poker, and pints being passed around. As the grand oak doors creaked open for what may very well have been the 10,000th time, you'd find the same cast of characters. The barkeep polishing a towel with another towel, the obliging piano player knocking out tunes with 3 working fingers and unshakable optimism, and customers with names like Slimy Joe or Half-Tooth Hank, their nicknames explaining more than you'd like about their dental situations or general life choices. But this wasn't one of those wild, raucous nights full of broken chairs and dramatically flung shot glasses. No. This was later. Quieter. The hour when boots came off, candles burned low, and even the poker cheats were getting philosophical. This was when the saloon's whispery secondary purpose emerged. It was part hotel, part social club, part therapy practice, if we're being generous. You see, by this point in the evening, all the showdowns had been postponed on account of mutual fatigue, and the real business began. Not of guns or whiskey, but of stories. Not every man who stumbled into a saloon was seeking trouble or triumph. Some were just seeking conversation, preferably one that didn't involve cattle prices or haunting memories of a showdown involving a squirrel and a pickaxe. Long story, never ends well. That's when the more linguistically adept entertainers took their seats, alongside the more familiar services the saloon offered, some practical, some scandalous, some involving mysterious magic tonics that could allegedly cure lumbago and attract wealth. You'd often find women, and occasionally men, who possessed another valuable gift, the ability to listen. With ears finely tuned to heartbreak, boredom, or an intense desire to monologue about the price of iron nails, these conversationalists would lean in across candlelit tables, smile knowingly and say, "Tell me everything." Until they did. One tired farmer explained in dreamy detail a vision he'd had that involved turning badlands into broccoli fields. A wandering saxophonist, we're still not sure how the saxophone got out there, once recalled every town he'd ever played, including 3 that later turned out to be dreams. And one melancholic outlaw spoke softly to a woman named Miss Loretta for nearly 2 hours, only to reveal at the very end that Miss Loretta was actually his goat, and he had no idea where she'd gotten to. None of this was listed on a menu. No chalkboard outside read, "Emotional catharsis, 5 cents per minute." But truth be told, this soft, strange, soulful service was what many patrons ended up paying for. A listener, a shoulder, a laugh. And in that warm, oil lamp-lit space, where the smell of cigar smoke mingled with that timeless perfume of old wood and spilled bourbon, the saloon revealed its final secret. It was a pause. A magical pause in the chaos of life. A place where time tipped its hat and slowed its trot. Where sorrows and silliness could sit at the same table, drinking tea brewed from stolen hotel linens and optimism. So when the piano man finally played his last note, or at least tried to, and then sheepishly corrected it after an awkward pause, and the barkeep put his last glass on the shelf, the saloon dimmed into a gentle hush. Those who didn't have a bed rolled into one of the upstairs rooms, often tucking in next to both dreams and regrets. The night wrapped its velvet arms around the creaky building, and even the ghosts of cowboys past, who hung out near the back door playing invisible dice, whispered their goodnights. And so the saloons of the West, with all their noise and nonsense, held something rare: connection. Not always dignified, rarely predictable, occasionally scented with goat, but connection all the same. Sleep now, dear traveler. Let the wind carry your thoughts out beyond the canyon, past the stables and into the stars. The saloons are closed, the lamps are out, and even Slimy Joe is snoring soundly beneath his Stetson, dreaming of broccoli fields and conversations that never really ended. Good night.